Hi there. So I wanted to comment on a video that was on Karen, the Meaning Code's channel about a week ago, and for me it was a total home run. This is my favorite. This is my favorite interview yet that she's had, and that's saying a lot, by the way. It was an amazing pairing of D.C. Schindler, who you know from John Vervaeke, the scholar from Catholic University, which is my alma mater, by the way, who wrote Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, and who Vervaeke says is the best Platonic scholar. I think he said something like that. Certainly holds him in the highest regard. And Ian McGilchrist, who we all know from The Master and His Emissary. So Schindler is a Christian, and McGilchrist, I don't think he professes a religion, but they unite in the unpacking of the nature of God and of reality. And I have to say, this dialogue comes as close to my own understanding of God and reality as anything I've seen in this corner. And that's one of the reasons I want to comment on it, probably also as an effort to consolidate my own personal philosophy based on the influences in this corner, very much so, and in the past 10 or 15 years, and also because I admire Karen's work so much. So if you don't mind, before I review this video, let me expound on the stance, what I believe to be the stance at this point. And I think the stance is having a good metaphysics that mirrors experience in all cases, and that may be a religious or non-religious metaphysics. To have an open stance to what presents itself to you. This is the hardest thing for us to do. We're very resistant. We like certainty. We like our opinions. So that is a tough one, and that is actually underlies a lot of spiritual practice. And then to combine the two, use the grounding of your metaphysics and what presents itself to you to find richness in every moment. And sometimes those moments are not going to be so pleasant. All of the above are addressed in the ideas in this dialogue. So the dialogue begins with an inspired choice on Karen's part. The discarded image, C.S. Lewis, he has a depiction of Aristotle's unmoved mover. God does not move top down like a engineer or tinkerer, but we are we, meaning the entire universe, inorganic all the way up to human beings, are moved by God, bottom up, by quality, let's say, by the good. Now, when Karen evokes Michael Levin, she uses the phrase growing towards. And I think the difference, and I don't know if this is really a major difference, in Neoplatonism and the good and Christianity and God and the metaphysics of quality is in the metaphysics of quality, the good is the way. It's more of an Eastern understanding. It's the relationship of static and dynamics. It's kind of like Tao. It unfolds and changes right there as the events happen. Static patterns meet and transform via dynamic quality, versus in Neoplatonism and ultimately Christianity and Schindler's conception, the universe is oriented towards. So metaphysics of quality might say it's inherent within. Yet, unavoidably, metaphysics of quality has an evolutionary aspect which kind of belies that conception. And Persig reconciled it by saying that the unmoving mover is at the center of a wheel on a cart moving forward. That was his unification of East and West. And of course, as clarified in On Quality, quality and God really are the same. Phaedrus in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance really hated Aristotle, but I'll say it again. Phaedrus wasn't Persig, and in fact, when Robert reads Aristotle, he goes, "Why did he hate this guy so much? I mean, I don't particularly find him interesting, but I don't understand the vitriol." The whole demeaning and relegation of the good to being subservient to truth as the crux of the end of arete and the beginning of the Church of Reason, that sounds accurate. I think that's probably right, and it was the beginning of the end, let's say. But even... probably if you did an analysis, you could see these ideas beginning to merge anyway. It's just a trajectory. But remember what Nietzsche said about Jesus. I think Nietzsche said this. It may have been Jung. Sometimes I confuse them. That truth and equality that he introduced, that was new to Christ, ended up diminishing his own religion and relegating it, as Nietzsche said, to a shadow on the cave wall. And the living, wrathful, and equally benevolent God of Carl Jung and the Jewish faith had to be lost for equality and truth to prosper, and arete had to be demeaned for material progress. So was it better to put arete aside for the sake of progress? Well, yes and no. So let's put a pin in that, because that's addressed in this dialogue in a way that was very meaningful to me. So great metaphysics may be when what you observe can be explained without limit or boundary. And that metaphysics can do that. So unlike scientific theories that replaced religion, these scientific theories have limits. So let's look at the proposition that these two, let's look at the proposition of this dialogue, that God is love, and it's a limitless, timeless, eternal metaphysical proposition. And there's nothing to argue against, really, except you may say, well, if God is good, then why are there bad things? And the conclusion, God is love, but love must be free. And the price of freedom is things don't look like we think they should, says McGilchrist. Quality always draws us away from what's restrictive. And in that, in that drawing away from what's restrictive, things kind of may fall apart a little. This is a new territory, and sometimes those new territories don't work out the way that we think they should. But think about this freedom aspect. We don't want to be restrained, and punishment is just that. Going to jail, you can find either too many rules or too much chaos restrictive. You're not only you can be in a jail of too much noise around you, right? And what you're really looking for, not just you, but everything in the universe, is looking for freedom from top-down enforcement and bottom-up noise. So freedom is the nature of the universe. The nature of the universe is love. The two must be a pair, and freedom is not going to mean that you can control something. It is going to do what it does. So D.C. Schindler says that order is the ultimate, but McGilchrist says that there must be disorder with the order. Of course, static and dynamic quality. This is a conjugate pair. They must be together. They're equally important to one another in the metaphysics of quality. But let's change this a little bit in McGilchrist's conception. He says something really good and important, that this pair is not equal in the big picture, that they are a necessary pair, but one can subsume the other, like the good can embrace evil, but not vice versa. The ordering principle ultimately subsumes the chaos. It will become chaotic, things will become chaotic again, but order comes in again in the form of good, being found in the mess, the solution to the problem. We're always still solving problems. That's what the good does. It finds this thing that has gone wrong and comes in and tries to fix it. Sometimes it doesn't, the job doesn't last. And sometimes the problems emerge from that fixing. That's the nature. It's on and on and on. But ultimately, the ordering principle orders chaos. Things fall apart and the ordering principle comes in again. Dynamic quality can embrace and sometimes subsume static patterns, and in fact it's necessary for anything to become, to change, to grow, to become better, to become perfect, let's say, to at least have the sense that it can become perfect. The consumption of static patterns by dynamic quality is the nature of the manifest universe. So this is like what Schindler says about order, not as a rigid state, but as an ordering principle that embraces disorder or chaos and continually updates it. And maybe that's what the Felix Culpa is also describing, that this absolute principle of reality that they, McGilchrist and D.C. Principle and Persig agree on, and probably Jordan Peterson too. The organism, they said this, it's really good. I think McGilchrist said this. The organism can embrace the mechanism, but the mechanism cannot embrace the organism. And that's like the map and the territory. They are partners, but one ultimately is bigger than the other. And that's, of course, McGilchrist's right and left hemisphere. At one point, Karen talks about painting in a totally Persigian way, in terms of inspiration or dynamic quality. And that inspiration informs the next stroke of paint, which is the analog of that quality event of inspiration. The painting is multi-leveled. You have the material, the artist, and her being, the idea of beauty, and moving towards a perfection. All of this, on all these levels, move towards that perfection that is that beauty. Perfection doesn't exist out there. It is in here. It is in that continual updating of inspiration. McGilchrist says something interesting about matter as a field of potential. Think about what Tesla, who I think actually had it right, said about light. It's a sound wave in the ether. And matter is hard light, another modality of the ether, an ether perturbation. And I get all this from Ken Wheeler, of course, Theoria Epiphosis, which I'll link to below, who is a Platonist, a Neoplatonist, and someone who has integrated monistic metaphysics, the purest metaphysics from both the East and the West. So it's a channel that has really helped me understand in a pared down way how physics actually operates. And he affirms, Ken Wheeler affirms that physical and metaphysical are one and the same. I'm not sure that McGilchrist, when he made this statement, is thinking of ether, but he does say it's a field of a certain kind that can seem to collapse and move. Descriptively, that's as close to the ether as you could probably get, and it doesn't exist anywhere. It is not material, it is potential. But it's the only physics that makes sense to me. And I wonder if D.C. Schindler kind of implies this in the proposition that we might start reevaluating physics away from mechanistic physics, in fact, a reversal from mechanistic physics. The ether model is a totality of flow. It's just, I'm not a scientist, obviously. I'm a person who listens to one idea and listens to the other and picks the one that lines up with reality better, and the ether model lines up with reality better. Now, there's one thing I want to talk about that I absolutely love and I think is so important, and this is going back to that idea of progress, because our value system is actually mechanistic. It's truth-based, in terms of mechanical truth, not quality, arete, or love-based. We keep making things faster, cheaper, lighter, more efficient. Our values are wealth, physical comfort, and power. I think McGilchrist said that. But is this better? As D.C. Schindler says, what if we remove the notion of progress altogether and just live well? Now, those two came together in that moment 100%. And maybe so should we. Think about it. The first time I encountered this idea that progress, maybe wasn't the ultimate way you want to structure human civilization, and that maybe living forever isn't necessarily the best option to a good life, was from Alan Watts. And then that idea really blew me away, because I too was so brainwashed into believing that material efficiency and living as long as possible is ultimate progress. Now we look at the result of that. We've destroyed our environment with plastics, with chemicals, with overbuilding, with electromagnetism. It's a nightmare. I love it when McGilchrist says, they say we can increase your cognitive intelligence. I don't want to increase my cognitive intelligence. I want to be a full human being. Perhaps 70 years is enough, as the Bible says. And there's been a new study that just came out. I really like listening to near-death experiences. I find them very comforting, and I find the fact that there is so much overlap between everyone who has them reassuring in a metaphysical sense. And there's been a new study that came out with over 500 patients. Interesting study. I'll link to it below. It was on News Nation, about scientifically trying to evaluate near-death experiences. And the scientist who did it has that little edge that some of these guys have these days, where they are not, they are implying that they're not discounting something ephemeral, something spiritual, let's say. As a talking point, and not to advocate for it, Karen brings up Wolfram's particle physics. And considering what I just said about the ether model, I completely reject Wolfram's metaphysics as adamantly as McGilchrist does. Wolfram has particleized everything with his Eem particle, and in a material world, you just have no place else to go. I love when McGilchrist says, how well does a theory of particles explain things better? All it does is end up with endless physical explanations that go, seem to go smaller and smaller and smaller. So he kind of cracks me up the way he says this theory gives him the willies, and I agree. As in, consciousness itself is made out of particles and sound, phonons. He calls, this is a great line that he uses, he calls particles an artifact of the analytical mind's retrospection, meaning they are purely intellectual level objects. In the ether model, the smallest particle is the hydrogen atom. And you might look at the shape of the hydrogen atom and see if you don't see it in other places. Interestingly, they say, I don't know who said this, I think it was McGilchrist. He says the point of time is to give the multiplicity, is to allow multiplicity to exist from the unity and to give form to the love itself, which is relation. And relationship must be between two, so there has to be a separation of the unity for love to manifest. And if you think about the representation of all spiritual practices, there is that separation. There are always two elements. You'll see this in the language of creation, the separation and the relationship between heaven and earth, between yin and yang, between that circle with a dot in the middle that you see everywhere in monistic, that is the representation of monistic metaphysics. Wolfgang Smith uses that as his icon, he calls it. So the totality is both, but once something divides, there's no end to that division. And at least, and this last part, so there's no end to that division, which means that is how the universe manifests. And it goes on and on and on, and quality is separating and creating at all times, and this is the manifest universe. It begins from that first separation, just like a cell. You see it over and over again. You see these same metaphysical properties in just about everything. So in this last part somewhere, someone says something about the Trinity being a representation of that unity and division. In other words, the Trinity symbolizes relationship. And in the C.S. Lewis passage, he made it very clear, you love God, but God loves you too. You are part of God, but you're connected to him with love, and that connection is the unity in him, of being part of him. Therefore, unity and multiplicity can coexist. They are a conjugate pair, but unity is the parent and can subsume multiplicity. And there's a lot more to be said about that, so that's something to think about. But the one transcends time and space, and it can probably be associated somehow with that counter space in Ken Wheeler's theory, or ether. And by the way, Ken Wheeler got a lot of his understanding from not just monistic metaphysics, but also from Tesla and the early electrical engineer scientists who actually created the power grid as we know it, but whose understanding is not the same as you're going to have to listen to it. I can't explain this that well. But whose understanding is not the common understanding that we have today, which is particle-based. So if you're looking if you're looking at it through the lens of ether physics, which is counter space, metaphysically it is the mode in which God creates the universe. It's non-existence, and then it's willed into existence, let's say. And unity can subsume the multiplicity, but aspects of multiplicity, will never be able to subsume or transcend God. Right? Even though we believe otherwise. And so when they say, but who created God? You have to re-ask the question. As Persig would say, that's a moo state. And D.C. Schindler says, And he always goes back to Plato. Well, the more I learn about Platonism, the more I see a pretty coherent metaphysics that does a much better job of explaining reality than some of the confusing stuff I see on the physics channels. But you do have deep thinkers like Wolfgang Smith and even, Don Hoffman, Bernardo Castro, who are coming back around. Listen to Don Hoffman on Theories of Everything. That's what I got out of it. And Wolfgang is a Platonist. Hoffman seems to have some consonance with a Vedantic teacher like Rupert Spira. In terms of the metaphysics quality, McGilchrist ends with saying it is not out there or in us, it is in relationship, and that is what God or love or quality is, relationship. Early on in my journey to understand Pirsig, Lee Glover, an extremely intelligent man who very much understands Pirsig, told me, if you want to understand Pirsig, you need to see his philosophy in terms of relationship. He's exactly right. Excellent dialogue. I loved it. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, Dr. Schindler and Dr. McGilchrist. I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.